Well, it's 7 o'clock and good evening and welcome to tonight's webinar. My name is Michael Danner. I'm the Associate Executive Director for Church Vitality for Mennonite Church USA, and I am your host for tonight's webinar. The focus for tonight's webinar is the resolution entitled Clarification on Mennonite Church USA Polity and the Role of the Membership Guidelines of Mennonite Church USA. I know it's a mouthful, but that's the title, and it's a resolution that will be considered in the May 2022 Special Delegate Assembly of Mennonite Church USA. Some details about tonight's webinar. Tonight's gathering is in a webinar format, so all attendees are muted and the chat is disabled. We will, however, be posting links to the resources in the chat, including a link to MCUSA Delegates resource page, where you can find the proposed resolutions, webinar recordings, links for upcoming events, and other information, including registration information for the special delegate session. We do welcome your questions, and we'll try to get to as many as we can this evening. Please feel free to use the Q&A feature in the toolbar on your screen, depending on what kind of computer you have. It might be at the bottom. If you're on an iPad, it might be at the top. So just find that toolbar and look for the Q&A question. You can put questions there. Also, if you need Spanish interpretation, please click the globe icon, and that is also on the toolbar. Just again, for clarity, the proposed resolution entitled Clarification on the Mennonite Church USA Polity and the Role of the Membership Guidelines of Mennonite Church USA is the focus of this session. And so there have been previous webinars covering other topics, covering other resolutions. There'll also be future webinars covering resolutions we haven't got to, but this is the one we're going to focus on tonight. And again, this is a resolution that the delegates will actually vote on at the Special Delegate Assembly in May of 2022. And again, the special resource page on MCUSA's website is the place you're going to find information about that gathering. For tonight's session, this is what we're going to do. We're going to begin by simply reading the proposed resolution. And then we're going to hear from three members of the executive board that have agreed to be on our panel. And they're going to answer three questions. Each of them will answer three questions. And then we're going to answer any questions that you may have. So anything that you submit through the Q&A. Yeah, I want to introduce now the three executive board members. And what I'm going to do is kind of give their name, and then they're going to give you a brief introduction about who they are and where they're coming from and what they're bringing to tonight's webinar. So here are the three members from the executive board. I'll start with Linda Dibble, who is the moderator of Mennonite Church USA.
Hi there. I am a retired part-time chaplain and district pastor for PNMC, Pacific Northwest Mennonite Conference. My husband Rob and I live in Albany, Oregon, and attend Albany Mennonite Church. We have 4 grown children and 6 grandchildren, and we provide childcare to the youngest 2 3 days a week. I've been on the executive board since 2017 and served on the listening committee and resolutions committee from 2013 to 2021. Good evening to you all.
Thank you, Linda. Let's go to Bishop Leslie Francisco III.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's good to be with you tonight. I am Leslie Francisco from Virginia, the Hampton Roads area. I've just recently retired after 38 years of pastoral service at the Calvary Community Church located in Hampton. I'm married, so my wife is Natalie. We have 3 adult daughters, and currently we have 2 grandsons, 1 5 and 1 3, which tend to take up a lot of our time right now. I'm also the chair of the African American Mennonite Association, as well as serving on the executive board. Since retiring, I've taken on a role as chaplain for the Hampton Police Department and serving our community in that fashion as well. So glad to be with you tonight.
Thank you, Bishop. And Todd Lehman.
Good evening. From Kansas, from the center of our country. I have worked in pastoral ministry for over 15 years. Currently, I work with a local restorative justice organization, Offender Victim Ministries, as executive director. I grew up in Ohio and have lived in Kansas for the past 20 years. I'm married to Julie, and we have 2 elementary age daughters, and it's been a privilege and a joy to serve on the executive board for these last 3 years.
Yeah, thank you, Linda, Leslie, and Todd for making yourselves available this evening. Let's begin with the word of prayer, and then we'll jump into the resolution. Please pray with me. Gracious God, we thank you for this evening. I thank you for each person that's gathered here tonight who cares deeply about the Mennonite Church USA and the issues that are contained in this resolution. I pray that you will be present with us, help us to listen to one another and to get clarity about church processes and how to participate and what it all may mean, and just guide our time tonight and be present with each of the panelists as they also answer these questions. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so the place we're going to start is just reading the actual resolution, just so that we can all have it kind of fresh before us. The executive board resolution is only 2 pages, so it's not that long, but it does contain some history that I think is relevant. And so, again, the title of the resolution is Clarification on Mennonite Church USA Polity and the Role of the Membership Guidelines of Mennonite Church USA, and it's for consideration by the Delegate Assembly, May 2022, Kansas City, Missouri. Background, 1, it says the membership guidelines for the formation of Mennonite Church USA were created to define the expectations for member conferences as they joined MCUSA. Denominations had differing polity around the roles of area conferences that led to how each denomination handled pastors officiating a same-sex marriage. In 1999, the membership guidelines failed to pass due to a lack of clarity around the status of dual conference congregations, disciplined by one denomination, but not the other, for allowing openly gay members. 3, for integration to move forward, Section 3 was added to the membership guidelines to clarify MCUSA's expectations for area conferences on these matters. Both delegate bodies approved these guidelines in 2001. 4, the membership guidelines for the formation of MCUSA were created to facilitate the integration of Mennonite Church and General Conference into a new denomination. The guidelines were to be reviewed for their ongoing usefulness in 6 years, which would have been 2007. Number 5, in 2007, the Constituency Leaders Council, CLC, began a review of the membership guidelines. Still, conflict over gay persons in the church made the review process difficult, and it didn't move forward. In 2013, the executive board submitted a revised version of the guidelines to the delegate body as an administrative update. No delegate vote was taken. I just want to pause there. The current version of the membership guidelines is that last version, which was presented as an administrative update in 2013. And so at this point, that would be the 3rd version of the membership guidelines. There was a 1999 version. It was also updated in 2001 to a 2nd version, which was then updated in 2013. And Cami is going to put links to all of those 3 versions of the guidelines in the chat, so you can take a look at them. If you've been president of the church through the history, you might remember them, but it is useful to actually go and see the progression, read the 99, see the differences in the 2001, and then see the differences from 2001 to 2013. So just that aside, I'm going to picking back up now in the resolution itself. Number 7 says in 2015, the Kansas City 2015 Delegate Assembly adopted the resolution on the status of the membership guidelines, stating the membership guidelines adopted by the delegates in 2001 and updated in 2013 shall continue to serve Mennonite Church USA as the guiding document for questions regarding church membership and same-sex relationships, marriages, alongside the confession of faith in a Mennonite perspective. The resolution, forbearance in the midst of differences, affirmed that, quote, while acknowledging different interpretations, we affirm the centrality of Jesus Christ and the authority of Scripture as an essential part of our collective discernment. We also affirm the goodness of marriage, singleness, celibacy, sexual intimacy within a marriage covenant, and fidelity for all people, unquote. The resolution also acknowledged that, quote, there is currently no consensus within MCUSA on whether it is appropriate to bless Christians who are in same-sex covenanted unions, unquote. Therefore, quote, we call on all those in MCUSA to offer grace, love, and forbearance towards conferences, congregations, and pastors in our body who in different ways seek to be faithful to our Lord Jesus Christ on matters related to same-sex covenant unions, unquote. Since 2015, conferences, congregations, and pastors have lived into this resolution, resulting in varied practices concerning same-sex marriage and the credentialing of same-sex married persons. The Delegate Assembly also passed the three-part resolution on the status of the membership guidelines. The resolution explained that sections 1 and 2 of the membership guidelines, quote, provided a biblical foundation for church membership and explained the multifaceted policy and practice of membership now embodied in the Mennonite Church USA bylaws, unquote. The resolution also explained that the MCUSA Constituency Leaders Council recommended the inclusion of section 3 in 2001 to clarify, quote, some issues related to homosexuality in membership, unquote. The 2015 resolution sought delegate feedback on the ongoing relevance of the membership guidelines for MCUSA. The relevance of the membership guidelines was tested by this statement affirmed by the delegate body. The membership guidelines adopted by the delegates in 2001 and updated in 2013 shall continue to serve Mennonite Church USA as a guiding document for questions regarding church membership and same-sex relationships, marriages, alongside the confession of faith. This resolution also stated that Delegate Assembly will not entertain changes to the membership guidelines for the next 4 years, unquote. That moratorium ended at the Delegate Assembly in MinnoCon 19. These two resolutions are in tension as MCUSA conferences, congregations, and pastors live into the freedom granted by the resolution forbearance in the midst of differences. Section 3 of the membership guidelines has ceased to be actively enforced policy within Mennonite Church USA. There has been a consistent articulation from the LGBTQ members of MCUSA that Section 3 of the membership guidelines has caused them harm. The prohibition against credentialed MCUSA pastors performing same-sex marriages in the membership guidelines is not an actively enforced policy in all congregations and conferences. The policy statement in the membership guidelines states pastors holding credentials in a conference of Mennonite Church USA may not perform a same-sex covenant ceremony. Such action would be grounds for review of their credentials by their area conference ministers credentialing body, unquote. Neither the original membership guidelines for the formation of Mennonite Church USA, nor the current version, nor a shared understanding of ministerial leadership, a polity for Mennonite Church Canada and Mennonite Church USA outline the review process or gives authority to the executive board of MCUSA to supersede the governance authority of the area conference or local congregation. Pastoral accountability is a function of the area conference, which holds the credential. It is not the responsibility of the executive board. Pastors, congregations, and area conferences discern the appropriateness of performing same-sex marriages in their context. Congregations are accountable to area conferences. Conferences have broad latitude in determining membership and credentialing. The original membership guidelines for the formation of Mennonite Church USA state that disputes related to Section 3 be resolved by area conferences, not the executive board. In that spirit, we commit to the difficult work of being church together amidst our differences, working at biblical justice and reconciliation where there is conflict. Resolution, and so this is the actual resolution that will be voted on. It says, therefore, we retire the membership guidelines as active polity in Mennonite Church USA. This resolution was approved by the Mennonite Church USA Executive Board April 16th of 2021. So that is the whole resolution. Again, that's available for you to look at and print out if you want to do whatever you need to. It's at the delegate resources page on Mennonite Church USA's website. And so now the questions, the panelists for actually every panelist dealing specifically with the resolution, they're all asked the same 3 questions. And so the 3 questions tonight for the executive board members are the same. And the first question is, I'll name the questions and then we'll actually get to answering them. But the first question is, why did you write this resolution? The second is, what impact do you think it will have on Mennonite Church USA? And the third one is, how does the proposed resolution enable us to join God's activities in the world? And so we'll just start with the first one and jump right in. And so why did you write this resolution? And Linda, if you want to jump in and start, yeah, why did Why did the executive board write this resolution?
Well, my answers to all of these questions are pretty brief. Actually, they're the same, and I'll just read the whole thing for each time because it is so brief. The executive board believes that this resolution will help clarify and clean up our polity documents, limit redundancies in documents, and allow congregations to live into the call to be transformed by our minds and our attitudes and to join God's activities in the world.
Thanks, Linda. Let's go to Bishop Francisco. How would you answer that? Why did you write this resolution? And I should state that you were all board members in April of 2021. So you were all partner to this.
Yeah, I kind of formulated a thought that the resolution was really written to, I believe, to finalize a document that was originally intended as a formation document. The membership guidelines, as I understood it, were never intended to be a legislative document of do's and don'ts, but it was rather a meeting of the minds to try and bring two denominations together that were seeking middle ground to merge into a united family of believers. So with our understanding of congregational polity, we recognize within the construct of the denomination, there is no ruling authority to enforce one particular view or another particular view or theological interpretations and practices. So we understand that we are created as of the priesthood of the believers. So each congregation should have the ability to discern their understanding along with their conference as to how they apply what they feel fits their particular niche. And it's not a decision that comes from the top down from the executive board.
Yeah, thank you, Bishop. But Todd, why did you write this resolution? Or why did EB write this resolution?
Yeah, I agree with both what Linda and Bishop said, and I'll just briefly add, as we looked at the membership guidelines, 2/3 of those guidelines were unnecessary because of their inclusion in other places, other documents. And then our practices and our policies were not in sync with Section 3. And our polity does not empower the denomination to enforce it one way or another. So I'll stop there.
Yeah. Thank you all. Let's go to the second question. I think it's fair to say that no matter how you feel about the membership guidelines and some of the questions raised there, that the membership guidelines themselves have become the focus of conflict within Mennonite Church USA pretty much from 2001 even into the present. And so this resolution is seeking to actually retire those guidelines as active polity. What impact do you think passing that resolution, so if this resolution is passed, what impact do you think that would have on Mennonite Church USA? And this time I'll start with the bishop. Just a light question.
Well, thanks. My personal belief is unity. I trust that this resolution will bring clarity to the body of Christ on what it means to have congregational polity and what it means to be the priesthood of the believers. And I'm believing, I'm praying that we'll find consensus and we'll learn how to live together in spite of our differences, recognizing that we are all children of God. And so I'm really praying for unity, that somehow this will unify us amongst our differences.
Yeah, thank you. Let's go to Todd. Todd, what impact do you think it will have on Mennonite Church USA?
I'm going to keep this short and to the point, I think, or to a point that an aspirational point, I suppose. The impact should be minimal. I say should, and I emphasize that it should be minimal, as no policy or practices will need to change because of this resolution. And so then therefore I would point right back to Bishop's response and say that's the impact that this should have.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. And Linda, let's go to Linda.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with both Bishop and Todd. I think that this resolution will actually emphasize the congregational role much more heavily than what we have emphasized in the past. And I will stick to my opening statement that says that it will allow congregations to live into the call to be transformed and to join God's activities in the world.
Yeah, thank you, Linda. Just a reminder for those of you tuning into the webinar, if you have questions as we go ahead and use the Q&A feature at the top or bottom of your screen in the toolbar, and we will try to answer as many questions we have. We're moving fairly quickly through these. So let's go to the question 3. And that is how does the proposed resolution actually enable us to join God's activities in the world? So what's maybe the missional impact of a resolution like this if it's passed? This time we'll start with Todd.
Well, I'd say that remains to be seen, of course. I think of this as a question also of what could MCUSA be if not focused on or distracted by this discussion that has occupied so much of our church time for so many years now. My hope and my prayer in terms of the impact or how this resolution could enable us to join God's activities in the world, my hope and my prayer, and I believe that of the executive board, is that we can be freed to focus on doing the work of sharing God's healing and of being hope for the world.
Thank you, Todd. Let's go to Linda. And how does this proposed resolution enable us to join God's activities in the world?
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, I'm in agreement with Todd. Every congregation is set in its own location, its own cultural setting, and every congregation has a call from God to be a ministry of peace and hope and justice in their own location. And so I don't think that we are expecting this to change any focus that you as a congregational member have in your world. And so the impact will be minimal, I believe. We're not asking pastors or congregations to do anything differently than what they have been doing and what they hope to do in the future.
Thank you, Linda. And let's go to Bishop.
Well, being the oldest pastor on tonight, I tend to always take a text or give scriptural validation for my thoughts. But as I understand scripture, the Bible says, "For God so loved the world." How does this resolution enable us to join God's activity in the world? I think when we understand what the call of God is to love the world, not the perfect, not the imperfect, not those who have it all together, not those who fit into our nice little neat niches. But we are to go into all the world and preach the good news to all creations. And I think that means that sometimes it gets a little messy for us, but the center of that is our centrality in Christ and the love of God that, as Todd mentioned, and as Linda did, that we see the church as a unit, as a unified body of believers. And I also want to say that I appreciate what Linda said, that every church has its culture, it has its niche. And we have to be sensitive to that. Some churches are called in different areas and they have different ministry capacities, but we're all called to show the love of God.
Yeah, thank you, Bishop, and thank you, panelists, for answering those three foundational questions that are a part of each of our webinars. There's two questions that came in. Let's so far, and let's answer the first question. The word retire in the resolution is controversial. Can you say something about that word choice? So why choose the word retire and not some other word?
I'll try to work at that, and then Bishop and Todd can join me. The reason we chose the word retire is because, like me, I'm retired. I once had a job, and I once did things to fulfill the expectations of that job. And at this point, we have recognized that these guidelines are not working for any number of people, most of whom happen to be conference ministers and ministers themselves, and then also congregations. So in that sense, we've used the word retire, and it once was part of our history, and we are asking that it is no longer part of what we are leaning on.
Yeah, thank you, Linda. Todd or Bishop?
I think I would echo what Linda said. We recognized that there was value in this process in helping us to utilize this tool to get us to today. We would have never come to this point without these particular tools. But now we're facing a new season. So I agree with Linda. I think she appropriately said it. We chose the word retire.
It's an interesting question. I thought the word retire was fairly benign, but apparently that's not the case in all places. I guess my memory is the executive board was not trying to make any kind of statement by using that word, but simply recognizing, as has been said, that the guidelines were created for a purpose and for a time, and they fulfilled that purpose in that time, and now it's time to move on. That's my memory of our discussion as the executive board.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that in choosing the word retire, no one on the executive board thought that word was controversial at the time. It probably came up later as it was considered controversial by some who received it. And some of it, I think, might be because there's the impression that it's trying to making this a polity issue and kind of just moving it aside, and let's just kind of move over without actually consider some of the deeper issues. But yeah, that's I don't think anyone thought it was controversial until we heard it was. Another question, the next question, and this is a little bit longer. So it says, as I understand that with the 3 sections contained in the membership guidelines, sections 1 and 2 remain in the MCUSA bylaws. So to be clear, is it correct to say that retiring the guidelines removes only section 3? And removing section 3 essentially affirms conferences and congregations as the locus of decision-making authority relative to the issues contained in section 3. Right, so I don't know if you caught that, but so essentially we're just removing section 3, and does that affirm really congregational and conference polity around issues of same-sex marriage and also the credentialing of same-sex married persons?
Again, I think it does go back to the congregations to decide how they will answer that question of same-sex marriage, same-sex inclusion, accepting persons of differing gender identities. And so we're hoping to affirm and strengthen the congregational site of any polity that is driven upwards to the conference and then denominational level.
Yeah, I think I know we're saying we agree with each other quite a bit, but I think I don't think that's a bad thing. It is important, and in my travels across the denomination and talking with individuals, some people tend to think that executive board has the authority to make concrete decisions and then pass them down. That's not who we are. We are a group that facilitates what we hear the church say. And so I think it's important that, that congregations and conferences have the opportunity and the authority to make those decisions as such as they are relevant to their particular settings. So the answer to that question, I think, would be yes.
Yeah, Todd, anything to add, or you don't have?
I would just add briefly that I think because of our church polity, the work of the executive board staff was challenging, and they were being asked, I believe they were being asked to do things that they didn't have the authority to do or say, decisions to make. And so therefore the removal of the membership guidelines removes also some of that confusion, and it actually frees up our executive board staff to better serve the whole church, our whole denomination. And I think, and maybe Michael, you want to speak to that a little bit, or correct me where I misspoke there, but I think that was also a piece of it that the executive board was considering.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't. Yeah, I don't really have anything to add, Todd, to that. But yeah, I mean, in general, I think the statement is pretty clear. Like sections 1 and 2 are concerned in the bylaw. So in one sense, sections 1 and 2 of the guidelines actually became irrelevant in 2002. So when the bylaws were actually affirmed, that actually encapsulated all that. And so that really they remain with us because of section 3. I think that is important. And the clarity that's being offered by the resolution is that exactly what you said, that the congregations, and there are certain things that congregations and conferences have responsibility for within our polity, and so this cleans that up a little bit and takes away the expectation that the executive board is going to manage those kinds of things. Because even the resolution itself says that if there's conflict between, like the membership guidelines themselves say, if there's conflict between this, well, it's not the original guidelines, but I'm sorry, but it does say that conferences are supposed to deal with one another if there's differing interpretations of that, and that's carried forth in the forbearance resolution as well. So I don't know if I helped or made that worse, Todd, but so the interesting. So there's a comment and a question that are kind of interesting that I'm gonna read. So first is the comment, and that's, as a member of the CDC at the time this was adopted, I think Bishop Francisco is correct. Don't you like hearing that? The bishop is correct that it was agreed upon in order to facilitate the merger of two entities. I don't think people thought it would control behavior forever. So that is one kind of, you'll hear two different understandings of what the guidelines were supposed to do. But this is a common one. They weren't supposed to control behavior forever. And in the resolution itself, it does state that they were to be revisited in 2006 for their ongoing usefulness. So there was some understanding that these were for the formation of MCUSA. But in the administrative update in 2013, they did shift to becoming now what people talk to as a foundational document, right? So that's the comment with a little bit of my commentary. The next question, it says the current guidelines state teaching positions of the church regarding marriage, one man and one woman, and they state that congregation or credentialed leaders shall not perform same-sex marriages. Those teaching positions and that prohibition disappear upon the retirement of the guidelines. Is that correct? So I don't know if that's all clear, but
I think when someone says teaching position of the church, what they're doing is referring to the confession of faith. And the confession of faith it has never, well, in the front, I'm trying to find where my, on my notes, excuse me a minute. I should have looked at this before I started. but the Confession of Faith does not purport to be a binding document or a rule book, but rather guidelines. And so when we talk about teaching position of the church, I think we can refer to the Confession of Faith, which at this point, there is no intention of changing that. And people have to live with guidelines rather than rules. And that's sort of how it is right now.
Yeah, I'll jump in I'll jump in a little bit on this one too. As I read the question is, if really we're talking about removing section 3 and we remove section 3, what's in section 3 that's not other places in our polity, right? That might be another way to state it. Is there something in there that then goes away that we don't have? And so the idea about marriage being defined as one man, one woman for life would not go away with the retirement of the membership guidelines, because that's present in the Confession of Faith and a Mennonite perspective. However you understand that confession functioning, that is actually in there. At this point, there's also in section 3, there is a statement that says no credentialed leader in Mennonite Church USA shall perform a same-sex marriage, and if they do, that would be grounds for a credential review. That statement itself is not anywhere else in any other polity document. So a shared understanding of ministerial leadership at this time simply says that before a pastor performs a same-sex marriage, they need to consult with the area conference to get the conference's discernment upon around that action. So each conference is discerned it differently. So what the shared understanding does now is refers pastors to their credentialing body as to the appropriateness. And depending on the conference, that could lead to a credential review. It could lead to an immediate suspension of credentials if you do a same-sex marriage. So that really then varies, but it does kind of kick it back to the conference. Section 3 also has a statement that affirms the statements of Purdue and Saskatoon from the 80s as the teaching position of the church. And so that's the only place those documents, historical documents, are mentioned in current polity. And so if section 3 is gone, those statements go away. So essentially the moral theological framework has to come from the confession, and the polity is dealt with in the shared understanding. I don't know if that made sense, if that made that more clear or less clear, but on the first part, no, the definition of marriage doesn't change doesn't go away, because that's in the confession. And in the shared understanding, it actually already reflects the polity that this resolution actually leans into, which is that same-sex marriages are the congregation's discernment, and credentialing is a conference matter. So I don't know if that helps, but that's how I would answer that. Next question. So if the resolution is to retire the membership guidelines, does this retire all other membership guidelines? Not sure I fully understand that. Does anyone want to take a crack at that? My short answer is the resolution just retires a specific a particular document entitled membership guidelines, not any membership guidelines. It doesn't change the bylaws, for instance, in any way, shape, or form. So all the understandings of membership that are current in the bylaws would be still effective, because this doesn't change that at all. It just retires the document itself called the membership guidelines. So
yeah, I would reiterate that it does not change the bylaws in any way. And so I don't think that, I'm just going to follow up and say, yeah, Michael's right.
Yeah, I don't know if there's other opinions on that.
I agree, Michael is right.
And Michael, maybe you want to give us I'll give a quick overview, and maybe you can give us a quick refresher of how membership happens in MCUSA. Congregations choose to be part of a conference, a local conference, and that conference then is the membership of that conference then is part of MCUSA, and so the membership flows that direction rather than the other direction.
Yeah, and there's actually a webinar that kind of goes into the structure. But essentially, if you go back to like even the merger, you had two denominations made up of various entities, congregations, and like districts and things of that nature. But when they joined, what they did was create a structure where the actual conference, whether you're an MC, Mennonite Church, or a general conference, the actual conferences joined Mennonite Church USA. And so the membership guidelines were the commitments that those conferences made to become a part of Mennonite Church USA at its formation. And then what we have in our bylaws is what we call derived membership. And so congregations they're not direct members of Mennonite Church USA. Congregations are members of conferences. And if the conference they're a member of is a member conference of Mennonite Church USA, they are members of Mennonite Church USA de facto. Basically, they have derived membership, and so that's how that works in our system. So,
and again, let's not forget that congregations individually make their own polity documents and statements about who who can join their church and what the membership role might look like.
Yeah, and maybe Cammie, you can put up a link to the bylaws over in the chat. I'm one of the few people that encourages folks to read bylaws. Bylaws are really, really important because they actually then set out the nature of the relationships between people, and they're really helpful, between how does a congregation and a conference and the denomination function. There's a question here that says, are there any congregations and or conferences who are calling for a change in polity that would authorize a hierarchy of power? Which is a really, it's an interesting question. I'm not aware of any. I don't know about you three, of anyone that's saying that. I think probably the other way that I would talk about that kind of question or power is that power, in an Anabaptist context, the idea of a centralized authority that kind of dictates to all others is not really consistent with our understanding of a voluntary association or the kind of church that we want to be. But I would also say that our polity recognizes that authority functions in different places for different purposes within the church. Right, so congregation, and that's why I'd say go to the bylaws. The bylaws will say what the rights and responsibilities of a congregation are as a part of the overall church, and they would say, also say these are the rights and responsibilities of being a conference as a part, and these are the things that you're responsible for. And for the national body, these are the things that you're responsible for. And what this resolution says is that when it comes to credentialing and decisions about same-sex marriage, those decisions are the authority to make those decisions rests with the congregation and the conference, and it never rested with the executive body, right? And so that's one thing, but each level has different responsibilities and things they're responsible for the whole to function, right? And so that's a really important part. So it's shared authority with different areas of responsibility, but everybody has the own thing they're responsible for to make the church function. Okay, let's see this. So this one says, I'm concerned that this change would lead congregations to leave geographic conferences and align with national conferences with similar policies regarding this issue. Do you agree that this could happen? And if so, what do we lose with the weakening of the geographical conference structure? Want me to repeat it, or yeah, or I don't know, Bishop, if you have a response to that. So this was, will this, if this resolution is passed, will it lead to affinity-based conferences instead of geographical-based conferences? And will it mean that churches will shuffle to conferences that think like them as opposed to ones that are near them? And if so, what would that mean? What would that mean?
I'll take a stab at it. Can I say it? Stab? I'll take a stab at this. It seems like, yes, that could be a possibility. And in some cases, that is possibly already happening or has already happened in some instances in the past. And I would let it up to individuals to decipher what is lost. I don't need to speak for all in that case. And I think if now I'm not speaking on behalf of the executive board, I'm speaking on the behalf of one part of the executive board here, but if an affinity-based scenario allows churches who are of a different mind to remain together in the same larger body, I find that to be a win. I would much rather sit at a table with someone who has an opposed view to me, but can find fellowship in Christ with me, even though we might not see each other real often, but that we can still join together and fellowship in Christ in that way. And so if that is the alternative to congregations simply leaving the denomination, it may be the lesser of two evils. It may be not the ideal scenario, but I see that still as it may be a possibility, and I'd be willing to live with it if that were to happen. What do we lose? I'll let others address that also.
I think, Todd, you hit something that we don't talk about very often, in that sitting across the table from someone who has a diverse viewpoint is actually strengthening to us. It challenges our thinking, and sometimes we can learn from that. I know that my viewpoints of many things have changed over my lifetime, and the way I do things has changed largely because of input from other people. And so having diverse viewpoints sitting at the table is helpful to all of us. I would challenge congregations and individuals to consider working with other groups that may not look at issues, membership, same-sex marriage, women in ministry, any topic that you can come up with, to sit down with others that have a diverse viewpoint and challenge yourselves to stay in fellowship, stay together so that you can be stronger together. So that would be my response.
Yeah, I think I would, again, echo what Todd and Linda are saying. One of the things that strikes me is that it's always easier to uproot and go with the flow, or to go with a group of people who you have consensus with at that particular moment. But life has kind of taught me, and again, I speak for myself, that that may last for a little while, but eventually change does affect all of us. And so do we continually shift from one place to another because a viewpoint or some views that we don't agree with change? So I think there's strength, as Linda stated, there's strength in staying together and recognizing, instead of finger pointing, how can we weave together a tapestry of God's love and recognize that creation, human creation, we are all God's children. Now, we may not like some of the things that our brothers and sisters are doing, even in our own families, but they're still family. And I think at the end of the day, that in the church, we should be the first partaker of that practice, that we learn how to struggle with our differences, and we learn how to show the world that God is love. So we that's our missional duty.
Yeah, thanks. Now I'm gonna read the next one, and it's gonna be it'll be a good question. This is a good question. All right. So I mean, we're talking. What I'm hearing you say so far is this resolution will actually lean into congregational polity relative to LGBTQ persons, same-sex marriage, these issues. So here's the question: does this mean individual congregations would have the right to decide that LGBTQ individuals may not have equal opportunities within their church? Just want to clarify and make sure I am understanding everything. So do congregations have the right to decide LGBTQ individuals may not have equal opportunities within their church?
I think the answer to that is yes. And my suspicion would be that if that's the case, that probably LGBTQ persons might not be interested in joining that church. So if we say that they have the right to hire an LGBTQ person that's in a same-sex marriage, then they also have the right to not hire someone in that position.
Thanks, Linda. Others?
Yeah, if there is a fear, and I know that fear is a strong motivator, if there is a fear that if this resolution passes, that individual congregations or even holding whole conferences are being told to do something, I don't think that is at all the case, and that's not the intent of this resolution. And so, does a individual congregation still have the right to make their own individual decisions? I would totally agree with Linda and say absolutely. That this is not that this resolution is not trying to tell any individual congregation or conference how to act.
Right. Yeah, thank you, guys. Next question: does the local conference retain the authority to discipline a given congregation for the decision they make?
Again, I think as we've shared, this all emerges from congregations. And if congregations give conferences that authority, then conferences can make those kind of decisions. So we're trying to understand, what does it mean to be the priesthood of the believers? We want, sometimes we as human beings, we want somebody to make decisions as a collective body, and we want an organization or a hierarchy because we need somebody to take the responsibility. But then if it doesn't fit our agenda, we want to recognize the priesthood of the believers. I think it's not a give and take. We have to recognize the priesthood of the believers in all scenarios. And that's who we are as Anabaptists. We believe in, that's how we hear the voice of God, is when we have a consensus among the voices of our individual members.
Yeah. Another way to approach it too is if you look at our bylaws to answer that question really specifically, a congregation has a right to determine who the members of that local congregation are. That's their right. A conference actually has the responsibility of determining the membership guidelines for their own particular conference. So they decide who's in and who's out, and they would then retain the right to discipline a congregation within that, to make that decision. MCUSA then has the authority to determine which conferences are in or out of Mennonite Church USA. So that's a delegate process. The delegates, as a representative body of MCUSA, actually get to decide if a new conference wanted to enter MCUSA, there would be an application process. The delegates would decide. If a conference just went way off the rails, then there are scenarios where the CLC and our polity could recommend the removal of a conference. they could recommend that to the delegate body, and the delegates could actually vote to remove a whole conference from Mennonite Church USA. So the membership functions in different levels: congregations for their members, conferences for congregations, and the denomination for conferences. So yes, I mean, they essentially do retain that right. Great question. How will this change? So if this resolution passes, how will this change be helpful to LGBTQIA people?
Based on conversations I've had throughout the denomination, in my own conference and in my own church, my feeling is that those congregations that are more welcoming and inclusive already will be more able to state their position without feeling like they're directly contradicting something that the Mennonite Church denomination has stated as a guiding document. And so I think that it should allow LGBTQ persons to feel more accepted, more welcome, and included in congregational life and congregational functioning.
I think one of the things that to me is hinted at in this question about this question, and also the question about will congregations be allowed to restrict LGBTQ people's participation? What that highlights for me is just a real need for congregations and conferences to be very transparent about what their actively enforced policies are concerning LGBTQ people in the church, right? And so that idea that clarity is kindness, that people should know when they walk into a church, if they're a queer person, it's also any sort of oppressed group, women, they should know what actively enforced policies are in that congregation. And if there are restrictions based upon somebody because of their sexual orientation or their gender or some other thing, the church has a right to do that. But I would just encourage you to make sure that those policies are known so that people don't come into your community under this welcoming embrace that you might extend, and then only find out after they're there for a while that because of who they are, they're not welcome to participate in certain levels of leadership or certain rites or rituals in the church. And so, yeah, I can see the anxiety around a situation where each church gets to decide this for themselves. But yeah, how do you know what MCUSA, if they're all MCUSA churches, and how do you know that? So my encouragement would be, yes, that these are decisions that churches make, but please be clear about who you are to folks so that they know what they're entering into. That's just an aside. That's just my editorializing. That's not an official position of the church, or certainly not the executive board. So anyway, one question: what does this have to do? What does this all have to do with a resolution for repentance and transformation, if anything? I don't know if you want to speak to that, because it's referencing another resolution. Perhaps that's going to be off limits. But if you guys want to answer, anybody wants to take a crack at that?
Well, as moderator, I'll just say that is a different resolution, and the delegates will have a chance to decide whether they want to work with that in May. And so let's not mix resolution at this point.
All right, thank you, Linda. All right, so another question: does the board anticipate it to follow that because many congregations are not currently holding marriage in the manner described in Article 19 of the Confession of Faith, that it will soon become necessary to retire that section of the Confession of Faith? Has this discussion occurred?
Again, no, that discussion has not occurred. The Confession of Faith is a joint document between Mennonite Church USA and Mennonite Church Canada, and it would take work by leadership groups on both sides to make any kind of change to the confession of faith at this time. And there's not been any conversation about that. That's been substantive.
I would just say two things on that one. One would come from just a word out of church history. In general, not in general, you don't edit or revise confessions. So a confession is written, it captures the beliefs of a community at a particular time. As the community gets away from that, it does sometimes get out of step. Most people say a confession has about a 30-year shelf life. About every 30 years, the community's wandered away from some of the core teachings. At that point, if you discern that there's too much distance, you write a new confession. And so that would be the next step. Like if the church decides that, hey, this confession that we currently have, we're out of step with this in key ways, we need to write a renewed confession. That would be a global project. So there would never be a situation where you would remove a particular article or edit a particular article of any of our confessions, right? And so it'd be a new one, or we stick with the one we have, and eventually they become uncomfortable. There's a reason why we don't use Schleidheim, right? Because eventually it becomes uncomfortable to our modern sensibilities and understandings and things of that nature. The other thing I would just point out is because Article 19 of the Confession of Faith says in part that marriage is between one man and one woman for life. I want to make sure that given that confession, or given that article and what it says about marriage, it's not just same-sex marriage that threatens or is inconsistent with that confession. The widespread acceptance of divorce and remarriage in the church and the participation in the church in the ways that we currently do is also absolutely out of step with Article 19 of the Confession of Faith. And so in some ways, we've accommodated ourselves already to being at peace with things that are actually out of step with the confession. And so just to make sure that that doesn't land on queer people or same-sex marriage, there's some modern understandings of marriage that are out of step with Article 19 as well. And just to bring up that point. Next question. Is this resolution in any way preparing congregations to develop a response to what may or may not be coming from government with respect to regulating churches and church membership? Yeah, I don't know if anyone's, I'm not sure what's it. I don't personally know what's at mind.
Can we ask for clarification on that? I'm not sure where they're talking about government.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that either. I don't know if the person who wrote that question can write a more clarification. We can come back to it. So next question. So will the idea of at variance be retired? So the idea that a church is at variance with the teaching positions of the church, will that idea be retired as well?
Bishop, you might have some thoughts on this. My first thought is that, again, conferences and congregations have to work on what on their polity statements, and they should be clear on what those polity statements are. So at variance, that's a language from the section 3, I believe, of the membership guidelines. So from the Mennonite church denominational viewpoint, there would be no need for that language.
Yeah, I think you're right, Linda. We haven't had that discussion per se in terms of doing the research on that, and I don't have it right in front of me, but that would be my understanding as well, that term at variance would probably go away. And because we clearly outlined that that section, line 70 and 71 on the resolution states that disputes related to section 3 be resolved by area conferences and not the executive board. So I don't think that's an area that we would even speak to specifically.
Yeah, I don't recognize, I don't think that and this is just my recollection, but I don't think that the phrase "at variance" is actually anywhere in any of our official documents. I think it's language that was adopted to describe people that are congregations or conferences or pastors that were practicing things that were inconsistent with the teaching position. So that would be a way to kind of label that as at variance. But okay, yeah, I don't know. So the clarification on this question about government is this would be like government requirements for diversity in the congregation, much like diversity in the workplace. And so, right, I get this. I think I get this question. Thank you for clarifying. So, in general, like in the United States, religious organizations are immune from diversity and inclusion, anti-discrimination laws. Like the church can literally be, if it's rooted in a religious belief, can actually discriminate against particular people for particular reasons. And in American law, there's quite a lot of freedom in that. There's less freedom in Canada for that kind of, so anti-discrimination laws actually apply to churches and nonprofits and religious organizations the same way they would everyone else. But currently in America, that's not the case. But is this preparing the way for an anticipation that maybe there'll be legal requirements, anti-discrimination rules applied to churches? This was a fear that I think a lot of people had when same-sex marriage was legalized the first time. And I know when I was a conference minister, this happened, where people were concerned that they would now be forced to perform same-sex marriages, even if they had a religious exemption because of the law. So I don't know, you guys can answer that. I don't think that this has any connection to that. That certainly wasn't in mind. It was never an overt kind of part of the discussion about the guidelines and this resolution. So it may do that in some ways, but it wasn't intended that way. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. So do we have any other resources for congregations to study this topic before May? Like, what other resources are present?
I think one of the greatest resources.
Oh, go ahead, Bishop.
No, I was gonna say one of the best resources that I've seen is to go to the MCUSA website and go on the Delegate special session. There are webinars, there's all types of resources there. I think all the education, there's a ton of things that we can be educated on and give clarity to right there. So that would be my recommendation is check out the website.
Yeah, Linda, you were going to say?
Same answer.
Yeah, so go to the website. The communications team is doing an excellent job of providing resources on this resolution and every resolution. And so, yeah, go to the website. The link to that is also in the chat. One more question we haven't answered yet, but the person who asked it, is somebody that I care about deeply. So I'm going to pass it on to you. Who is responsible for the teaching position of the church, quote unquote? We hear a lot of talk about teaching positions. What are the teaching positions? Who is responsible for those? Who's like?
Frankly, it's a term that I was introduced to a couple of years ago, serving on the executive board, and I had never heard that term before. So my thinking on this, and I can be corrected, but my thinking is that the responsibility for teaching positions, that language may have come as a result of the membership guidelines. But really, in essence, teaching positions are the responsibility of Sunday school teachers and pastors and youth leaders and conference ministers, district pastors, and basically all of us as a group of Anabaptist people to work together to form a position on what we believe. And like we've said before, diversity helps us in forming those thinkings. And not every person's going to have the same answer when we get done with a conversation.
I think, Michael, you kind of hit that nail on the head also. when in my experience, when I hear the word teaching position, people are often referring back to the confession of faith. And they use that as a tool to say, this is the position of the church. This is what we believe. This is where we stand. And I think you talking about a 30-year life span for most confessions brings a little bit of clarity and relevance to, is there a time coming in the future where we need to re-examine and look at that? But that's another whole process. But I think most of the teaching position comes from confession of faith. Now, I stand to be corrected if that's not so.
And I would point back to what Bishop was talking about in some of his responses earlier about the fellowship of believers, that the fellowship, the local fellowship is probably where that teaching position comes from, kind of like what Linda was saying. It's very easy, or yeah, no, I think easy is probably the right word, to look for some authority above me to determine what I ought to do or what I ought not to do. That's typically human nature. And so when we think about this idea of a teaching position, seems like, oh, what can I point to that will help me not have to take, maybe sometimes not have to take the heat for what I want to teach, maybe sometimes not have to do the hard work of coming up with how the Spirit is leading in some cases. And so I think, first of all, I'm not sure the confession of faith as a confession document was ever meant to be positional necessarily. Rather, it was descriptive of a fellowship at the time. And so then when we make those into positional documents, I can understand why they have maybe only a 30-year lifespan, when that's probably not what they're intended to be used as moving into the future. So some thoughts about authority position, with an openness to continually ask and seek the Spirit. And I just want to point real quick to the, I can't even come up with the renewed commitments. There we go. The renewed commitments of MCUSA. I think if we have a teaching position on anything, this is a great place to start. The 3 commitments are to follow Jesus, to witness to God's peace, and to experience transformation. And if that's a position that we can agree on, then I believe we can move forward together, even when we have other disagreements.
Thank you. As a pastor of 20 years in the congregation, my first thought was, well, the immediate feedback mechanism for what's a teaching position is the congregation who hears my sermon. And they'll let you know really quick if you strayed into some areas that are not consistent with the boundaries. But the other thing there's something to point out is when we start talking about teaching positions, kind of underneath that is this question of authority, which is actually at the root of what led to Section 3 being added to begin with. And that's a question of who decides, right? And so who decides, who has authority to make this decision? And when it comes to teaching positions, in the conference I was at, we had 2 pastors that were different polarities relative to same-sex marriage. And they came together and did an excellent job of talking with our peer group about their different approaches. And one of the most interesting things that was probably the most illuminating in that conversation is when they were asked, what to you is the confession of faith? What is it, or what does it mean, or how does it function? That kind of question. And one of the people said, well, the confession of faith is what every credentialed leader in Mennonite Church USA is to teach and practice, and they're not to teach and practice anything other than that, right? That was one position. And the other person said, well, the confession of faith is what most Mennonites believe most of the time, right? Those are 2 very different understandings of the confession. And depending on what your perspective is, everything flows out of that relative to this question of teaching position and who's responsible for it. You know, if you're in that first camp, then there's got to be some sort of authority to enforce or boundary manage the teaching positions, which are what everybody's supposed to believe, to make sure nobody doesn't say or do something that's out of bounds. The other one is much more open, and it's that, no, we have discerning communities, and this could look differently in different places. But for the most part, this is what we would affirm as what we believe about the particular issues that are addressed within there, but in a way that's a little bit different, more centered set instead of bounded set, if you're familiar with that language. So I don't know if that's helpful, but yeah, underneath all of this is questions about authority and power, like how that functions in the church. So Linda.
Michael, yeah, I'd just like to add one of the resources that's out on our website is Glenn's white paper on dispelling the myths related to the membership of the Mennonite Church USA. And one of his points in here is that the Confession of Faith as a teaching document, or as a teaching position, as some people like to think of it as, was adopted in 1995 before the creation of MCUSA. And the document itself does not call itself a polity manual or a notebook. It defines itself in 6 ways. And I'll just read these. Number 1, guide for the interpretation of scripture. Number 2, guide for belief and practice. Number 3, foundation for unity. And we've heard that word a lot tonight. Number 4, outline for sharing of information with new members or the inquisitive. Number 5, an updated interpretation of belief and practice during change. And number 6, a discussion tool when talking with non-Mennonites. So this was written in 1995, and Michael said that our shelf life is around 30 years. So maybe in 5, 7, 10 years, we'll be looking at working on a new confession of faith, because some of these practicalities in this document no longer apply, but that's down the road.
Let's not quote Mike as too authoritative on that 30-year shelf life. Just a general observation. It's not like the date on your egg carton that says don't use after.
Okay, we're going to stamp this on our timeline. Michael says that.
Just a general observation is that's kind of about the intervals where people start to feel that this doesn't quite fit us. And I would encourage you to go back and read the confession. I mean, all 24 articles. There's even some summary statements, because it's also, I mean, talks about all kinds of other things. It's not just Article 19. There's other things relative to our relationship to government and society, witnessing to the state, some of those things. And so there might be other ways that we find ourselves to be a little bit out of step with that. Yeah,
I just want to offer that we've gotten maybe into the weeds or into the ditches a little bit with some of this discussion related to this particular resolution. These questions about the confession of faith, a rewrite of that, or a new one, question about anticipating government, etc. Those were not part of our executive board discussions related to this resolution. And so just to clarify, this is not intentional laying the groundwork for the future next move, or whatever that is. This is about these membership guidelines, this particular resolution. Now that we all are aware of unintended consequences, and I think that's maybe what we're talking about a little bit. That's not the reason for this resolution.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. We're at the end of our questions, and there's about 10 minutes left. I don't know if anyone has any other comments that you want to make, any closing words for Bishop, Todd, or Linda. We want to thank you for your responses. I've appreciated hearing from you all on these questions, and thank you for the gracious way you've answered the questions of the panelists or the participants in the webinar. Linda, you.
Yeah, I just want to say that I'm encouraged that people are actually interested in talking about this, and encouraged that you have questions about things, and hopefully that will help us when you come to visit to Kansas City in May 2022.
Yep. So if you have questions about participating in the special delegate session, again, go to MCUSA website, MennoniteUSA.org. There's information there about participating. If you want to know how many delegates your conference or your congregation has, all that information is there as well, and other resources. And if you have any questions, you can continue to. I don't even know what to do with your questions. I think there's a link for questions on the website as well, where you can contact us with other questions. So yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for being here. If there's nothing else and there's no other questions kind of showing up on the side, thank you and have a good night.